for those who weren't lucky enough to be here. If this is the first you've heard of The Point, we're a Chicago-based magazine of philosophical writing on contemporary life and culture. This is a cover for our new issue, which has a symposium on poetry called What is Poetry For? The issue is not ready yet, but it will be soon. And you can subscribe or look at some of our old issues at the front of out there. So I'm going to introduce, also just wanted to thank Poetry Magazine and Poetry Foundation for collaborating with us on this panel. We're really grateful to them for hosting and getting to use this amazing room. The way this will work is we're going to talk up here among ourselves for about 45 minutes, and then we'll open it up to questions, and altogether this should take about an hour, somewhere between an hour and 15 minutes. So to introduce our panelists, let's see, go from left to right. Kush Thompson is a political romantic poet, womanist, painter, teaching artist, and author of A Church Beneath the Bulldozer. She was voted runner-up Best Local Poet of 2014 by the Chicago Reader and one of the Roots 2005 Young Futurists. Kush is the co-founder of the Lady Church Initiative, where she hosts monthly meetings devoted to women empowerment and healing. Lamar Jorden is a multiple winner of Chicago's Louder Than a Bomb Youth Poetry Festival and starred in the 2010 documentary of the same name. Lamar's music project, The Lion Who Learned to Write, is set for release in 2016. Lamar has also been part of the Teaching Artist Corps at Young Chicago Authors. Srikanth Reddy is the author of 2 books of poetry, Facts for Visitors and Voyager, both published by the University of California Press. A book of criticism, Changing Subjects, Digressions in Modern American Poetry, was published by Oxford Press in 2012. He's also an associate professor of English at the University of Chicago. Don Scher edits Poetry Magazine. He's published 3 books of poems and edited 3 anthologies, as well as a critical edition of Basil Bunting's poems. His translations of Miguel Hernandez received the TLS Translation Prize, and a 2005 Vita Award recognized his contributions to American literature and literary community. Actually, going off that Vita mention, I'm going to start by actually reading a quote from Don Scher from an interview he did with Melissa Stoddard at Vita recently. And Don and Melissa, they began talking about the relationship between poetry and political activism, and which is something that really goes to the heart of this question of what poetry is for. And Don says in the interview that he's seen poets and poetry change people, both politically and personally, and that by activating the imagination, poets can help people go out into the world and solve problems that the poet can't solve. You ended that part of the conversation by saying, I think a poet should want to change the world. I don't know of a poet who doesn't write out of the impulse to say, the world could be better. That's sort of the plot of every decent poem. So this is not an uncontroversial statement. Several philosophers and writers, including Plato, Tolstoy, Rousseau, have not agreed that poets have any special stake in making the world a better place, or even if they did, that they would have any idea of how to go about doing it. Most famously, Plato argued that poets were dangerous because they wielded a very powerful weapon, poetry, without having been trained in how to use it or why. In other words, Plato agreed with Don that poets could change the world, but he doubted that this change would be for the better. Poets would therefore were only allowed in his philosophical republic, he said, and this really applied to all artists, it's just that poets were the worst. But they would only be allowed in his republic, he said, if they agreed to be censored by philosophers and politicians. Otherwise, they would corrupt the citizenry with their excessive sentimentality, their impulsiveness, and their prioritization of beauty and pleasure over morality and good citizenship.
Let me just stop you right there. You know, the politicians haven't done such a great job, have they? The political and other movements that were Platonic in nature have done great and devastating damage to all throughout human history since antiquity. So I don't feel daunted by, the idea that there's a Platonic argument against a comment I made in that interview. So I'll stand by at least thus far. I mean, there's the other guys you can quote, but Plato, he's like the great red herring, isn't he?
All right. Well, I don't expect anyone up here to agree with this, but I'm gonna lay it out and see how we can talk about the different kinds of responses we can have to this challenge. Just one more thing. I mean, within contemporary American society, poetry's contribution to a better world would also be questioned from a more pragmatic angle. Let's say we accept that the poet has a moral aim. Still, if you really want to make a better world, a scientist or a politician might ask, aren't there more reliable ways to do it than through poetry? So all that said, one of the reasons I chose to start with that quote from Don is that I think it does encapsulate a common feeling in the poetry world today that good poems are related in some way to the social good or to progressive political causes. Since this is something that hasn't been obvious to everyone, I want to start by asking, the panelists if they agree with Don's idea that every decent poem comes out of an impulse to make the world a better place. And if they do, if they could say more about how they see poets in particular working in relation to other kinds of political or social change. So Kush, I'm going to start with you. A couple of days on your Twitter, you retweeted a letter put together by the Dark Noise Collective, which is a poetry collective here in Chicago. And the letter was called "How Writers Can Join the Fight Against Police Violence." So I'd be curious just to start with like a really concrete example for you to talk about what kinds of things you thought were worthwhile in that letter, and just more generally how you see your poetry connecting with your political activism.
Hi, guys. So the Dark Noise Collective released a letter, a statement more so, a couple days ago. And I guess it was more of a call to artists who feel, I know that I felt like a couple years ago, as we know, like this isn't an isolated event. This has been happening for years and years coming. So a couple years ago, like I used to feel constricted in like, what can I, as somebody who only writes poems, do here? Like I have no other weapons here. So the Dark Noise released that a couple days ago, and it was more so saying like, if you're an artist or if you're a writer, like use your tools in this fight. Like you can help write out legislation forms. Like you can help write out, just other documents that we need, like letters of complaints, letters to Congress, like things like that. Things outside of poetry you can use your creative voice for. And I believe in that wholeheartedly. I haven't done anything like that myself, but I know that in this movement, like they also need artists. Like they need artists to write chants for protests. They need artists to craft statements. And that's something that I've been a part of in my work. Also, yeah, absolutely. I feel like, especially as a Black poet, like you can't escape writing about this. Like it shows up whether you want it to or not. I think before I even accepted my politics as what they are, I always had to write about my experience, and my experience is as a Black girl, as a Black woman. And then as my politics grew, it became, I feel like my Black girlhood or my Black womanhood is under attack, and how can I use my voice in that fight? So it's always there.
Thank you. So Srikanth, I'm going to go to you next. You have in your book, Changing Subjects, you explore how American poets have used this trope of digression as a figure for personal and political change. Maybe the most recognizable example of the kind of poet you're talking about is John Ashbery, who, as you say, addresses us from the drifting literary platform of houseboats, hot air balloons, and countless other pleasure craft. But you mention in the book, and this connects with how I started, that philosophers have traditionally been suspicious of digressive thinking. And it struck me that Plato, for instance, would say digression is exactly the problem with poets. They wander off somewhere and they don't know where they're going. What's worse, they're talented enough to make people follow them. Yeah. So I guess my question is, there's two questions just to expand on your idea of digression and how you see that in relation to politics. And also to say, could there be a poetry that was a digression away from politics?
Well, I guess I'll start with the last thing you said first, and say, yeah, I think that there's a kind of centripetal kind of, pull away from the political in, much poetic writing. And, to me, I think that that's something to kind of guard jealously and to value in the art form. And so, right now, it's a very hard time to talk about poetry in any terms other than the political. But I think that's why it's especially important to not allow our sense of any art, right, or of our lives to be overrun by the political or to be reduced to the political. And so, these digression is just a kind of figure of speech for the impulse to move off of the path that one is kind of supposed to be moving in. And I think that that's actually the more than ever kind of an important thing for poets to kind of be thinking about when there's so many pressures and imperatives on us to write toward a message, right? Plato wants poets to just be philosophers. That's why he's cranky with them. But I think that
He wants them to work for philosophers.
Yeah. And so, I think if you kind of evade or elude or digress away from those imperatives, I think that's where the art lies.
But there could be a serious danger, right, in digressing. I mean, poetry is. Yeah. We wouldn't want to deny that it has a power that makes it dangerous as well as possibly.
Well, you can't say that like poets are off doing something, nobody pays attention to it, and say it's dangerous if people follow them. I mean, that doesn't. Why worry about it? Why have the conversation? The digressiveness is freedom. I mean, it's a humanistic thing. In my statement that you started off with, I said decent poem. I meant decent like humanity, humanism decent. I mean, people being decent. That lives matter is decency. That's what I mean by decent. I don't mean good like Platonic good. Right. And I mean, I still think like the scientists and philosophers who have great followers have hardly accomplished so very much for us all beyond sort of the basics. What
have the poets accomplished?
Well, we have another poet too.
Maybe we can talk to Lamar about that. I'd be curious to hear your thoughts on this.
Yeah, I think my mic on. Y'all hear me? We good? How we feeling? We good? All right. I think poetry is a very powerful entity, right? As I think all forms of art are. I think all forms of art should reserve at least a piece of it to be used just for speaking about social issues and, having these political discourses that there isn't much room to have in like everyday life, right? So I think that through the power of poetry, a lot of poets can inspire people who may not be able to write poems, who may not be able to write a song or paint a picture. They can inspire those people to be the ones who write policy, who write legislation and do these things that the poets may not be interested in doing or may not, have the capability or the tools to do. I think poetry itself is such a powerful entity that it can do that work of mobilizing people who may not be gifted with the ability to move people with their words.
Are there poems, and this is really for everyone, but I mean, are there poems that you encountered in your life that you felt did that kind of thing in a powerful way? Yeah,
the first poem I wrote that let me know that there was a place for somebody who looked like me in poetry was a poem titled The Ugly Show by a poet by the name of Black Ice, who's from Philly. I caught the poem on an episode of Deaf Poetry. And before that, poetry to me was always presented in a form that had very little to do with me, right? Was not at all inclusive to or indicative of my experience as a black male growing up on the west side of Chicago. So seeing Black Ice spit a poem about the Ugly Show itself was about the Hurricane Katrina tragedy, and more so this country's response to it. Seeing that poem performed in that format that did a lot of rhyming and did a lot of the same elements that one might hear in a rap song, that let me know that there was a place for me in poetry. And that let me know that poems can be used to do that work of bringing light to these social injustices and also mobilizing people in an effort to, change them. Yeah. I think that's a job that's up to all of us as people and not just, the poets.
Other people want to weigh in on poems that they encountered earlier. I remember, Don, you said your meeting Allen Ginsberg was like an important...
Well, yeah, because, Ginsberg can be made out to be some kind of target or an easy target. I wouldn't necessarily put him in... I think he sort of pioneered an opening up of the diction, which is an American way of looking at the freedom that I'm talking about and that I think all of us are talking about, and a digressiveness with purpose. But I would say, to use examples, in March 2014 in Poetry Magazine, we published a poem by Claudia Rankine that ended up in Citizen, which wasn't out then, and Denez Smith's Alternate Names for Black Boys. These are poems that at the time, again, they were new. Nobody had seen them before. They weren't in a book or anything. And those poems did change people. They got like 8,000 to 12,000 hits a day. This was before Ferguson happened. When I say Ferguson, that's sad shorthand for media reporting of something that was always happening. Ferguson, in a wider consciousness, really just means that attention was drawn to something that had always happened. So at that moment, these poems were there, and people, it's like what you're describing. People realized that poetry wasn't, it wasn't something that's just on the page, and something about, aesthetics and sort of the sort of long-term culture. It had a more important immediate role to play that's not at odds with that inheritance that we hope to pass on to people, which isn't just limited to poetry, but of course, culture, politics, freedom, our values, if they're worth anything, and hold up. And so these poems managed to be proleptic. In other words, they anticipated the need for their own existence. That after these poems, and not just by Denez and Claudia, but Tim Siebels and Nikki Finney in that issue too, they were speaking to stuff that people were talking about all the time. It hadn't made it into the art form. It was in a lot of poetry, but it hadn't gotten a wide enough audience so that when people needed something to turn to, we always turn to journalism. We have that. We get Twitter. We see what's going on. But what are people really going to say about it? And they turn to the poets. In this case, that's documented, quantifiable fact. But not only that, in the long term, even 50 years or 100 years from now, when people look back at our time and look back at the city of Chicago, for instance, where we all just sit here right now, they're going to know what the historians say, they're going to know what the journalists have said, but what they're really going to want to ask is, what was it like then, and what were people doing? What were people thinking? What was it like to walk around here? And the only place I can really imagine they're going to be able to turn to is the poems that hold up and provide that kind of evidence and witness.
Do you feel, and if you want to read one of those, you feel free. If there's,
sure. Well, I think everybody knows Citizen. That's a book that's fresh every day. It's a book that changes in its literal configuration every day. And I think a lot of the folks here know Denez's work, which has grown incredibly since even just the 2 years ago when this poem appeared. But I'll read it and see for yourself what it might do. So alternate names for Black Boys. 1, smoke above the burning bush. 2, arch nemesis of summer night. 3, first son of soil. 4, coal awaiting spark and wind. 5, guilty until proven dead. 6, oil heavy starlight. 7, monster until proven ghost. 8, gone. 9, phoenix who forgets to unash. 10, going, gone. 11, gods of shovels and black veils. 12, what once passed for kindling. 13, fireworks at dawn. 14, brilliant shadow-hued coral. 15, I thought to leave this blank, but who am I to name us nothing? 16, prayer who learned to bite and sprint. 17, a mother's joy, and clutched breath.
Thanks. Yeah, yeah, and anyone who wants to read or do any I mean, I'm wary of conversations about poetry that have no poems in them. So, so just. Yeah, thanks. Shifting gears a little bit to some other questions about sort of how poetry defines itself today. Lamar, I was going to ask you. We had this article in our issue that sort of the critic Frank Guan makes the argument that given poetry's history in America as being an art of and about white aristocrats, it would be best to admit that its role as a contemporary art form has been surpassed by rap music. Which he says offers, quote, a superior verbal and tonal quality and a far larger audience, and is the form of American poetry that speaks clearly and honestly about money, violence, and social ambition. I'm curious what you thought of Frank's criticism in light of the fact that in your own poem, Blink, which is an amazing poem, everyone should go and watch online, you make a really sharp distinction between poetry and rap. So sort of, yeah.
Yeah, so I think in that actual quote, I think he actually used the word usurped when he talked about rap and its connection to poetry and how it exists in society. And I really had an issue with the word usurp being used in that context because I don't know if poetry would have ever risen to where rap is now in society just because of the fact that it doesn't contain the music behind it, right? And music is this powerful entity in and of itself, and it adds something to poetry that poetry cannot give itself, right? Music is a powerful connector, right? It brings so many people together of so many different races, backgrounds, whatever the case may be. But other than him actually using that word, I think rap has enhanced poetry. You know, it's kind of rehabilitated it. It's given it new life. Rap was the way that I got into poetry. As I said, at the time that I saw Black Ice's poem and, you know, decided that I could write poems, I had been writing raps for 6 years, right? And because of that background in writing and seeing a poem that was similar to this art form that I was very familiar with, that made poetry feel like it's something that, you know, again, could be inclusive of people who look like myself. And again, I think before rap was, you know, commercialized and before it was, you know, made to focus on lavish living and made to kind of put violence at the forefront of its music as opposed to what its original role in society was, which is speaking against these things before the commercialization of it. I think it was doing the work that poetry did, just adding another element to it, which was music. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so that's the distinction you make in the poem, has to do with the kind of materialism of it now.
Yeah. To speak on that poem. At that time, I was in a place where I was very angry at what mainstream rap had done to the culture of hip-hop and what it did to the craft. So I was speaking against those rappers who, I forget what I used to refer to that actual craft, but I was speaking against those rappers who use the craft and the form for things other than bringing light to these injustices that have been going on for centuries that rap spoke about at its inception.
So this is sort of for both Kush and Srikanth. You guys have both had experience with teaching poetry to very different kinds of people. Kush teaches mostly with kids, or at least that's one thing I'm interested in hearing you talk about. And Srikanth, I know, is teaching, you know, in an English department. And so I'm sort of interested for both of you how teaching has informed your own view of what poetry is for, how you make it attractive to the people that you're teaching. And kind of if that's informed your own views of poetry or your own poetry in some way.
Yeah. Word. So I teach poetry after school at 2 high schools in Inglewood. Those are 2 different experiences. The first school I teach at is Lindblom Math and Science Academy, and it's an after-school program that kids voluntarily go to. So they're already interested in poetry by way of slam poetry and spoken word and all that. So that's already made it cool. It's done my job for me. So yeah, I guess when we're talking about what poetry is for, this quote by a great Chicago poet named Patricia Smith always comes to mind. And she said that writing is the only throat that many of us have. So every time I think about like what the intention of my poetry is or what the duty of my poetry is, I always think of that quote. And that's, I feel, what I brought most strongly into my classrooms was like these kids who go through these experiences and want to have a voice for them. I feel like talking about their experiences was the strongest thing, making sure that they were telling their stories as they see them. This entire conversation around Black Lives Matter and politics and all these things that we feel are so far ahead of these kids, it's really not. Like, they experience it every day. They just don't know how to talk about it or how to connect their experiences to this larger conversation. And I feel like through poetry and through programs like Louder Than a Bomb, like, we definitely see that kids know exactly what we're talking about, and they're talking about it amongst each other, and they're bringing that to a larger platform. As far as like how to make it cool, I feel like hip hop and rap, as Lamar said, is a great way to push forth poetry. So usually when I'm teaching my workshops, I'll pair them with a hip hop song, and then the kids will see the connection there.
That's great. Yeah, much of what you're saying about teaching kids is just true about just teaching poetry at any level, and it really is about teaching children how to find a voice, right, and to realize that they have one and they have things to say, and that they have the right to use that voice. And I think probably like teaching small children how to do that reverberates in all kinds of ways to the teaching of poetry at any level, right? So yeah, I think that, I think the thing that I would say though is that, like, I love the name of the Dark Noise Collective, and what I like most about it is noise, and that noise isn't something that's necessarily directed toward an end, and so the question of like what is poetry for, to me seems like it kind of unravels in some ways what poetry is, because I think that in the nature of poetry, there's something that bucks against the question of utility. Right?
Do you worry though sometimes as an English professor? I mean, I was an English student, and that there is a pressure always to be providing what it's for,
a rationale,
a kind of
it.
Rationale for why we're studying this, and you do sometimes kind of end up instrumentalizing it. Yeah. And, I think that that's why, like, making noise, is a really important thing to, like, keep in the foreground of when we talk about the art. And it can be a dark noise, it can be a collective noise, it can be a bright noise, it can be an individual noise. But, I think that you have to kind of protect the unruliness of the art, and also to kind of protect its freedom from politics, or its ability to make the political strange because of its separation from the political. So we can ask questions about the political from within a poem. Yeah.
And look, I was thinking a lot about Jeffrey Hill, who just died, and the subject for us, which is what is poetry for, which is an impossible question, which means it's not really a question, but Jeffrey talks about that in a poem. And what he says is, I ask you what poems are for. So, it's not like we're answering. But he says, I ask you, what are poems for? They are to console us with their own gift, which is like perfect pitch. Let us commit that to our dust. What ought a poem to be? Answer, a sad and angry consolation. What is the poem? What figures say a sad and angry consolation? That's beautiful. Once more, a sad and angry consolation. So, I think that fits in with what everybody's been saying. And that's Jeffrey Hill, who is not.
But how does that relate for you then to the idea that the poet is always thinking of a better world, or has a better world in mind in a decent poem?
Because here too, and I mean, Jeffrey's an unusual example because for him, for lots of reasons, the language is falling and what he would call the common weal, the common health of society is broken. Mm-hmm. It's broken historically, it's broken over there in the United Kingdom right now. It was in the period all his life in which he was writing, and similarly, it's broken here. So what it does is that the sad and angry consolation does not concede defeat or anything. It concedes freedom, which comes with a kind of responsibility to do something. That's why he says, I ask you. And that's not passive.
Yeah. So I'm going to open it up for questions in a minute if people want to start thinking about that. I had one other question for Don, sort of just about your own, in terms of your role as poetry as sort of an institution. Coming back a little bit to this, and I know you used to work at Partisan Review, which was a place that certainly had a political set of beliefs about art and battles within the magazine.
Well, look, literary magazines were founded in that belief that that politics and poetry and art, just like you're describing, all these things are connected. They always were, but literary magazines were the only place where you could do it. Now we're lucky, we have everything. I mean, all kinds of media and performances and spaces and places, but we still do have magazines and literary magazines. So institution's sort of a misleading word. I mean, we're quite small compared to other institutions. I mean, Poetry Magazine is small compared to, like the University of Chicago or something. It's tiny.
Yes, but in the poetry world.
Well, the poetry world hasn't really got institutions. That's the point. I mean, poetry world has poems and poets and readers and listeners.
Yeah.
And there's no institutions.
I know, this is Plato's problem, no institutions. Poetry.
Well, it's
just people wandering around.
Yeah, it's people wandering around, right. That's the discursive essence of it, absolutely.
Yeah, but I guess I was just interested if your thinking's changed coming from Partisan Review, where there was this sense of there were real battles about what art should be doing.
Yeah, well, see, now those battles take place, like on Twitter and on TV and stuff. It's awful. I mean, you can't have nuanced stuff there. So that's why the poems are still good for it, because you can have detailed thinking there.
All right, well, I'm going to open it up for questions. We just ask that you wait for the microphone if you have a question. And also, we'd ask that you try to address the question to a specific person on the panel to keep this sort of, feeling like a dialogue and yeah.
To a specific person, I do have trouble with names, but you, and also I heard it from really the whole panel of a kind of common pattern of saying that hip-hop was something different from poetry, or even not poetry, or teaching poetry versus hip-hop. And I found that somewhat confusing, in the sense that, in my view, I'd see hip-hop as perhaps set to music, but a type of poetry, rather than something distinct from poetry. And I'm curious if people go deeper into that distinction that I heard, or maybe I heard wrong.
Yeah, I think I think because rap always uses rhyme, which is a poetic device, I think because of that, poetry is inherently a part of hip hop. But again, I think the music element kind of makes them different entities, right? It's more so the music itself than the genre of music that poetry exists in. Yeah, Kush, you want to speak to that?
You the rapper.
But yeah, I teach as well, and when I do teach, I also bring in a rap song to accompany the poem, just because, again, that element of music makes it a different entity than poetry. But the two are not, mutually exclusive. Poetry is definitely a part of rap because it exists so heavily on the poetic device that is rhyme. And then, of course, in the typical rap song, you're going to hear more poetic devices than just rhyme. You're going to hear onomatopoeia, and you're going to hear, assonance, and you're going to hear, all these other poetic devices that a rapper who's more well-versed in poetry may use. And even a rapper who's not traditionally trained in poetry may also use these things just because of that connection between rapping and poetry as it has existed throughout its history and society.
Thank you.
So what rappers are the most poetic to you?
I'm a big fan of Chance the Rapper's craft. I'm a big fan of old Eminem craft. Not so much Eminem as of late, but his craft and the way he used internal rhymes and the way he crafted his images in his early craft was amazing to me. Mick Jenkins is another rapper who I think kind of infuses more traditional poetry, or kind of infuses spoken word into his rap craft pretty well. And I'm not just saying that because he came up through Wordplay, which is an open mic in Chicago, hosted by young Chicago authors. But yeah, those are some rappers who I think about when I think of whose craft I really like. But again, music as a genre exists. You know, there are more elements to a good rap song than just writing good raps.
Well, and we're lucky too because we have people who do both. So like Jamila Woods, whose album just dropped the other day, and Nate Marshall. These are people who do both. It's not like a either or proposition. I mean, Nate Marshall's a Hopwood poet from Michigan, just like Frank O'Hara. These are guys that are well versed in poetry, and they do rap also. They're musicians. They're terrific musicians. So Chance the Rapper is great, but you all should listen to Jamila's new album and pay attention to Nate Marshall. And there's lots of other. I mean, in a way, Chicago is the epicenter right now for this great sort of combination that brings these different things together and illuminates all of them. But they are, they're still different. They serve different kinds of purposes, maybe have different audiences. But people now move back and forth between them with great, skill and amazing talent.
Yeah, shout out to No Name Gypsy as well. She's amazing if y'all haven't heard her.
It makes me think about like the way that ballads were on the kind of seam between poetry and music for hundreds of years, and it's like these are urban ballads now, and maybe there's not so much of a gap between music and poetry when you think about the long tradition of all those different forms.
There's one back there.
Hi there. This is a question for Don, although, of course, anyone else can speak to it if they likes to. I was a little surprised to hear that you say poetry doesn't have institutions. I think of English departments, particularly MFA programs, particularly maybe the top 15 MFA programs, as being institutions that disseminate poetry, that fund poetry, that also set the style and I would say also political agenda for poetry as well. And for instance, there's been a long history of explicitly political poetry in America that has not had a very good relationship to academia, and particularly MFA programs, at least in the post-war era. For instance, Walt Whitman's famous comment that the role of poetry is to cheer up slaves and horrify tyrants hasn't necessarily been, I would say, the enduring aesthetic in the university.
I think it is enduring. It isn't. You're right. It isn't, and that's why these institutions. I'm agnostic about it. And again, I think there's some false dichotomies that come up. I don't pay any attention to whatever MFA programs do or don't do. I read more poems in the English language than probably anybody on the planet. We get 120,000 poems sent here a year, and I read them all with Christina Pugh. We don't have interns or readers, so I'm reading that. Plus, I'm reading the books and the magazines that are around us. That's all I do is read. I don't see any influence. There's obviously, there's a kind of self-replicating impulse in MFA programs, but I don't see that as good or bad. It exists, but I think the magnitude of it is enlarged by some kind of extended attention to it. I don't see it as incompatible with the idea that poetry is free and can free itself from those institutions. It's free of and can free itself from all institutions. I don't think you need to be an English major. I was never an English major. I didn't take any English classes. And I think I know something about poetry. So I'm not exactly disagreeing with you, except to say that the word institution is kind of a code that is meaningless to most of the people who do read poetry. Poetry Magazine is out there. Most of our readers are general readers. They aren't people in MFA programs. They aren't other poets. All that, the sort of, shibboleths and stuff. They're just not true. We have data that shows it's not true. So when I say we don't have institutions, I mean that poetry, especially if it holds up and it lasts and it resonates with people, it's free of any institution. It may come from them or not come from them, but to me that's a small matter.
I'm just really resonating with what you're saying, and I guess part of me throughout the whole conversation was thinking that I felt like we were limiting the conversation to Plato's political philosophy, when he actually has a metaphysical and an ontological and epistemological philosophy on top of that, and I think that resonates with, and I forgot your name, the one who's talking, who might interrupt me at any minute. Yeah. About freedom, which I think when we're talking about being, we're talking about freedom from the mind, freedom from the system, from the trap, from the matrix. And I guess my question is, we're asking what is poetry for? And I'm not gonna ask what's freedom for, but to a certain extent, what does freedom mean to you, and why is it important that poetry means freedom when it comes to understanding being and having poetry be, for me, and I'm sure for everyone here, poetry is a portal into pure being, into that apolitical philosophy of being.
Mm-hmm.
Does that make sense?
Sure. Well, freedom is what we yearn for. I mean, we have to eat, we have to drink, and we have to be free. I mean, that's a yearning nobody has to teach you. You don't have to go to school to learn it. And a lot of the people who've never been anywhere near an institution of any kind that benefits them have that yearning and struggle for it. And this is what we hear about locally and nationally and internationally every minute of the day. You're hearing about people who have that yearning. It's that yearning. And it does get into poetry. Of course it does. That's a good place for it, because otherwise there's a lot of lost voices literally in wildernesses. Poetry is a home for the voice in the wilderness. That's why it can last. That's why people can read poetry from antiquity. We don't know who Sappho was. We don't know a thing about Sappho. We don't know that much really about Shakespeare. But their words resonate with us. The words are free and free themselves of their own contingencies and the surrounding controversies of the day and all that, and yet they still resonate. There's something alive in poetry like there's something alive in us. And poetry is alive because we're alive. And that's what I mean by freedom. I'm not talking about some kind of weird slogan, and I'm not talking about politics. I wouldn't get into politics probably myself if I was interested in freedom.
Do other people want to comment on that? I mean, obviously freedom's, there are choices that we make about what to read, and in any given society, whether you call them institutions or not, there are things that shape what gets considered an acceptable poem or a good poem. There are forms of I don't know if you'd say the word censorship, but there are ways in which we decide what we want to read and what sort of counts as poetry.
Poetry's never needed that. I mean, the great manuscript traditions, in the English language were free of institutions, so that women could not be published in print books in the English language. English literature we're talking about only a few hundred years ago. So manuscript circulation and verbal expression was a way, not just in English language culture, but many cultures allowed people to be free without being circumscribed by that process you're describing. Mm-hmm. Probably the things that are vetted and approved by some official structure fall away very quickly, so that if you read the bestseller lists, or the lists of sort of officially anointed, literary products from any given time, 20, 30, 50, 100 years later, people be astounded to see what they were. There are two great examples in our own sort of immediate consciousness when we talk about poetry. 100 years ago, if you ask people the official sort of vetted consensus about poetry, the names Emily Dickinson and Walt Whitman would never have entered into that process. Now, the first two poets we all seem to know about are people like Whitman and Emily Dickinson. So their work was free of that, and that's why it still means something to us. Whereas the sort of stuff that was edited and published and neatened up, no one here can probably name more than 3 of those poets.
This question is for anyone who wants it. What do you hate about poetry?
I'll answer
Good
that.
question. Yeah.
I hate poetry, period. What I hate most about poetry, I don't know. I feel like right now, I guess, I hate the commercialization of poetry. I hate that. Well, I love it and I hate it because I wouldn't be on this panel without that commercialization. But the way that slam poetry and spoken word poetry has commercialized poetry, there was this, I don't want to call it a movement, but during Brave New Voices a couple years ago, like there was this pushback when HBO started filming. They didn't want HBO to film them anymore, I guess, because after the first season of Brave New Voices that aired on HBO, there were just people that like wanted to capitalize on slam poetry. And I feel like there's the righteous pushback, but then there's also people that want to like get on camera and be that poet that's like the head of the movement and say poems that are completely detached from them. And I feel like that's completely taken away from what poetry is for, and it's just become like another way to become a celebrity, which is great, which brings people like myself and Lamar to panels like these where we can talk about poetry from a lens outside of just the written, but it's also a very hard thing to detach yourself from, is that commercialization of slam poetry.
Yeah, I echo that 2,000%.
Hi. I'm sorry if this is an odd question, but it seems to me the entire panel has been about, or the entire discussion has been about, circling around whether art or poetry in particular can be democratic, right? Like, there's this sense in which, like, Don is the gatekeeper to a very prestigious poetry magazine, and it seems like, there is this tension between what can be spoken, like what voices can be heard, and the tension between, letting people let them have a voice, like what Kush does when she teaches kids how to write poetry. So, like, this is a deeply personal question because as an aspiring academic, as a poet myself, like, how do you negotiate these things? Like, when the overarching sort of like understanding of what poetry is, what poetry can be published, still seems to be this weird kind of bougie acceptance of what is okay to talk about in the world. Like, how do aesthetic considerations come into all this? And I would like to hear Kush, whose work I really, really appreciate and admire, and Professor Reddy in particular. So yeah.
Okay, just to rephrase the question. Yeah, I feel like that issue about like what poetry is allowed to be published, like, I feel like I haven't faced that struggle yet myself. I feel like when you're submitting your work into these kind of magazines, then that's something that you would really face. But as far as like when I'm teaching, like, I don't acknowledge that struggle at all. I feel like in that situation, then you're teaching your students that there is power in self-publishing. There is power in joining collectives that'll publish your work for you, which is how my work came to be published, was through Young Chicago Authors and their publishing company. But yeah, so that's how I've seen young students' work be published. And then I think that there are poetry magazines that don't acknowledge these sort of stigmas, that don't have these sort of prejudices against what work and who can publish. So yeah, I feel like it's just about navigating those spaces and finding the right places for those kind of things and introducing them to different ways of being heard. I feel like the problem in that thinking is that there's only one way to get their voice out there, and there are several 100 million ways to get a young poet's story heard. You just have to seek out the right ones.
Srikanth?
So yeah, I think the question of like, how do you find your voice, or how do you construct your voice, and how do you find places where it can be heard, are really important. And then the other side of it, I think that relates to your question, is people very rarely talk about listening. when they talk about poetry. They talk about finding their voice, wanting to be heard, but they don't talk about listening. And I think that that's a very important part of what poetry can teach anyone. And kids especially learn a lot by listening to different kinds of poetry, just like you can learn from listening to different kinds of music. So, even listening to voices, poetic voices that have politically abhorrent views, Gertrude Stein is someone who is celebrated among the political left and the avant-garde, but because of her amazingly mesmerizing voice, right? But her politics are noxious, and you could say the same about Ezra Pound or about any number of other writers. And I think that really. We talk about writing and wanting to get our writing out there, but we don't talk so much about reading and listening and receiving poetry. And I think that that's something that needs to be part of the conversation more in a democratic context that you're raising.
This is a question for the moderator. When you put this program together with the title, What is Poetry For? Among the poets and the people professionally, so to speak, in the poetry world, did you get any pushback as to why does poetry have to be for anything? I mean, we don't have a panel about what are the paintings in the Arts Institute for, or what's the music at Symphony Hall for, or the operas at the Lyric Opera for. Why do we have to talk about what poetry's for? It's just for poetry. It's for itself. Did you pick that up at all from people that?
I would say I've picked it up on this panel.
We were being nice about it.
So the way our magazine works is in every issue we ask a question: what is X for? That's one section of the magazine. So we've done what is marriage for, what are sports for, what is film for. So we have actually done it with other art forms and other things besides poetry. And it's a perfectly reasonable response to say, I reject the question, it's not for anything. That's still an interesting response if you can make clear what you mean by it. And the idea of the question is to bring out, there are a lot of things we argue over when we're arguing over what's a good poem or what's a good film or what's a good marriage. These actually, you can't actually have these arguments without having some conception in your mind of what the thing is for. That's always in the background of those kinds of discussions. At least that's our theory. So that's sort of the idea of the panels, is to bring out different perspectives on the question, and certainly a valid perspective that I would expect to get from a lot of poets is, it's not for anything, or poetry makes nothing happen, or these kinds of things that have been heard. But of course, there are also people who would respond to that by saying, yeah, that's why we shouldn't have poetry. Or, and that's sort of why what I was trying to bring up at the beginning. So I think that's I hope it's an interesting debate.
Thanks for the lovely discussion, guys. I'd like to ask a question to Lamar, I guess, something that struck me as part of these follow-up questions, in addition to your original discussion. A large part of your draw to poetry, it seemed like in the first place, was this attempt to separate yourself in some way from this, corruption of the commercialization of hip hop. And it's interesting how that echoes so clearly, I guess, Jon's original, concerns about that he voiced about, well, poetry is dangerous in that exact same way. I guess my question is, how do you maintain that independence of, okay, poetry, here we can hang on to our freedom better or something somehow in a way that hip hop or these other tools might not be able to, or why is it that hip hop may be commercialized, to this degree that loses the power that you originally saw in it?
Yeah. Well, I want to first respond to that by saying that the commercialized hip hop isn't the only hip hop out there. And since writing that poem that was referenced earlier, I've come to realize and understand and appreciate that fact that there are alternatives to what we see on music videos, if anybody even watches music videos in 2016. Yeah, I agree that in response to another question that was asked about whether or not poetry is always about making the world better, I think a lot of poetry, in my experience, is more so about escaping the world that we're in. And I think that has been one of the ways that rap has been used, whether you're talking about the commercialized version of it or the more quote-unquote underground, authentic version of it. I think a lot of people write to escape certain realities. You know, you have folks in areas like Austin or Roseland or whatever the case may be who rap about these fantastical, lavish lives that they just are not living in real life. And I think that provides a sense of satisfaction for them, being able to escape reality and being able to envision the life that they want to live. And I definitely think, in my experience, that is one of the things that poetry is for, not just for creating a better world. I think that, again, that's the responsibility of all of us, and poetry is a tool that I do believe can get us there. But I also have experienced a lot of writing that seems as if it serves the purpose of escaping or serving as a form of escapism from the world that we're currently living in.
I was just thinking about all of the personal content that can be found in poetry, and I was wondering, like, where we could possibly draw a line between a diary and poetry, and if there is sort of a boundary that we cross sometimes when we create art.
So is there a person you would direct that to?
It could be anyone. Chiku, if you could maybe, I don't know.
Well, I think that probably, well, it's interesting because, if it is a diary, it's a public diary. It's a diary that you want the world to sneak into your bedroom and read, right? And, in some ways there's a great tradition of poets who write in that way. And then there are poets who, get up in the public square on top of, the soapbox and declaim their poetry. So, I think if I'm probably not the best panelist because I always kind of feel like whatever I say about poetry, I want to say the opposite of immediately afterwards. But, I think that, so like Emily Dickinson is someone who thought of her poetry as a letter to the world that never wrote back to her. And I think, the diary is one model, but it's got to be a diary that's the opposite of a diary. The letter to the world is one model, but it's got to be a letter to the world that nobody writes back to. The soapbox is one model, but the soapbox where no one's listening is probably what poetry is. So yeah.
It's always an interesting question too, what counts as confessional poetry at different times, or what, and sometimes that can be a way of dismissing certain kinds of poetry or as not being sufficiently publicly engaged or something. Other times it can be a compliment.
Yeah. Well, someone once said about someone who this is at a party was at, and there was in the time of the midriff bearing shirts, and someone said anyone who shows that much of their midriff has got something to hide. And it's kind of the same thing with political poetry or private confessional poetry. You're hiding something either way.
Right.
I want to also speak on that because I'm one of those poets who published their diary. Like, actually, literally, my chapbook contains scanned documents out of my diary. And as well, I guess against their will, but Kurt Cobain and Frida Kahlo And I consider that to be some of the best poetry I've ever read. Some of the best poetry I've ever written are things that nobody has ever seen before. And I feel that like the most honest poetry is in your diary. That's where you're most true to yourself. That's when you're not worrying about who's gonna read this, especially if you're a poet who shares their work with the world. You're not thinking about like, I have to change this metaphor into something that people will understand. It's honest, and that's the best kind of poetry there is, I think. I think the more personal, the better. That's my opinion.
What? Do we have time for one more? Okay.
I didn't know it was me. Okay. So I know you guys harped on freedom. I'd like to talk a bit about belief. And this is honestly to anyone on the panel. I can't really choose. Sorry, I know we're supposed to be discerning. So the virtues and pitfalls of belief are well documented in various art forms, especially poetry. And some people could say that's antiquated, but I think it's belief. It's completely relevant.
Sorry, when you say belief, do you mean religious belief or?
I mean I guess the question begets like what you think belief means, if it's tied to ideology or belief in oneself or belief in religion. But basically contemporarily we're thinking about disbelief in certain structures, like a dismay or a wrestling with the status quo. So do you think right now, I guess there's belief about our current climate, political climate, what have you, and there's disbelief, but do you think that conversely there is, to be a poet, you have to believe in something? Or do you think belief is inherent to poetry as it is to fiction? I know that's talked about a lot. Sorry if that was a convoluted question, and belief is a huge subject matter.
Yeah. So maybe I don't know if this is a good way of framing it, but something like, we've talked a lot about poetry as opposition to something that is dissatisfying about the world, but what about the flip side of that, which is poetry as a kind of belief or affirmation?
But also the irony there is that they're not mutually exclusive.
Right. So yeah, I don't know if anyone wants to talk about that. I mean, maybe Don, you could talk about how you balance that within the magazine.
Well, I don't ever think about it, I'm afraid. It goes back to an earlier question. I mean, I take poems that are over here and I put them over there. That's what I do. I mean, for me, the question is, it doesn't matter. Poetry is various. It contains multitudes. So does every one of us, whether you're a poet or not. And there isn't such a monolithic thing as a belief. I don't think I believe that. I think our feelings, thoughts, convictions about things alter moment to moment, day to day, over time. Look at the young Wordsworth and the elderly Wordsworth. And, I think things happen to people, and poetry can be a record of that process, which is a rigorous and strenuous record of it. But I don't know how to speak of belief in the singular. So I guess I don't really think about it that much. I think the world challenges us, and maybe we acquire beliefs or desperately need them and try them on and cast them off, and maybe we come by great disappointment, in which case our belief can be shaken in whatever it was we had a belief in. And poetry is a record of that. It's an ongoing record of it. It's record an individual instance, poem by poem for a poet, and all that adds up so that the poets, the sort of record of our time will consist of massive sort of quantities of data about this question. But there isn't a simple thing to say about it. It's just kind of built into our humanity. Again, I would say, if we had more time to talk about it, that belief becomes a trickier problem and question and liability when it comes to things like philosophy and science and politics than it does in poetry, because poetry survives the errors of its beliefs. Science doesn't. Politics does not. History can't. And philosophy, nobody knows.
I don't know. It's survived a lot of errors.
Yeah.
Does anyone else want to speak to that question or on those themes? Thinking about, I don't know, how you balance in your own poetry affirmation or belief in something with criticism.
Yeah, to add to what Don was saying, I think poetry is a record of what we believe at that time. Those beliefs may change. One of my favorite quotes, I don't know who's the original author of the quote, I just credit it to Erykah Badu, is that is that truth requires no belief, right? And in addition to what was just said, I think the art form itself, holistically, doesn't really require that either, as it is a record of what that author believed in at that time.
It's interesting. Yeah, it's not like I would never say I believe in a poet or a poem. I would say I love a poem or I love a poet. But and that's interesting that how like truth does not require belief. Poetry doesn't require belief. I love poems where I don't believe in any of the principles that the poem is.
All right, well, maybe we should end with that succinct statement. So yeah, that's it for this part of the conversation. In the back, as I mentioned, you'll be able to subscribe to both The Point and Poetry. There's a joint subscription that you can get today for a discount. And yeah, if you subscribe, as I mentioned, you'll get The Point's 12th issue probably next month. Which has this symposium on what is poetry for, so you can see how some poets and critics either answered the question or refused to answer it, or spoke to it in some way. There's one person who wrote a poem about it, sort of, or so this space will be closing soon, but we'll also be migrating over to the Carrymen Pub to keep talking, and we'd love to have any of you join us. We'll be in the back room. The pub is just around the corner. It's 661 North Clark and Erie. So that's it. Thanks again to Poetry.